Welcome everyone. Thanks very much for joining us for this this talk. It's an event that's co-hosted by the Conflict, Security and Development Research Group at King's College London and the Urban Violence Research Network. So I'm delighted that we have two speakers, the two authors of the book, the Votes, Drugs and Violence, the Political Logic of Criminal Wars in Mexico. There's a strong interest in this topic in general, and particularly in the work of both authors around this. And it's going to be a fascinating discussion. We're going to, first of all, have a presentation from Guillermo Trejo. Guillermo is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame and Director of the Notre Dame Violence and Transitional Justice Lab at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies. And then he'll be followed by Sandra, a co-author. Sandra Lay is an assistant professor at CIDE's Political Studies Division in Mexico City. And she also coordinates the program for the study of violence. So we'll have the speakers speak first, and then if you have any questions, please just put them in the Q&A box. There should be a little dedicated Q&A box different to the main messaging function. And when we get to that point, then I will either ask the authors directly or they might answer directly, and we'll go through as many as we can. So thank you very much both for joining us. Guillermo, over to you.
Thank you so much, and greetings from South Bend, Indiana, to everyone in London, the UK and Europe joining us tonight. And thank you to the Conflict Group and to the Urban Violence Network for this very kind invitation. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
So thanks for joining us. We'll be discussing some of the key motivations, arguments, and findings that Sandra Lay and I have in this book, Votes, Drugs, and Violence, The Political Logic of Criminal Wars in Mexico, that was published a few months ago. So let me start just by sharing with you the front page. This is an image of an explosion in Ciudad Juarez by the end of the Felipe Calderón sexenio. By this time, 2010, 2011, Mexico was experiencing uncommon levels of criminal violence that led many people to rethink the nature of these conflicts. Levels of violence were so extreme, so unprecedented, that rivaled or surpassed the levels of violence that we typically see in civil war. And it's in this context that the story of the book really begins. 10 years after transitioning from authoritarian rule to democracy, and this is what many of us were wondering, Sandra and I, together with a whole generation of scholars, why is it that 10 years into democracy, by 2010, Mexico experienced levels of violence that were sometimes 5 to 7 times greater than what we typically see in civil wars. Criminal violence at the time already seemed to be intimately connected with politics and the dynamics of Mexico's transition to electoral democracy. But major theories of criminal violence in criminology, sociology, and economics really had little to say about politics. And let me say from the outset that this book engages into a very active dialogue with criminology, sociology, the economics of crime, with historians, anthropologists. But the reality is that when we made a very extensive assessment about many of these literatures written in different parts of the world, it was evident that politics was an omitted variable, that the political story was never systematically recognized nor tested in many of the theories about organized crime and organized crime violence. For the most part, if you look mostly at criminology, sociology, and economics, organized criminal groups like drug cartels were often seen as private illegal enterprises, and I underline the private aspect. The second is that for the most part, these drug trafficking organizations and organized criminal groups were systematically seen as apolitical groups and organized crime as an apolitical phenomenon. This was not very useful for us, this view of OCGs as private apolitical groups. And this is in summary, the challenge we faced. The literature led us to try to more systematically develop the political theory of criminal violence, building on multiple studies. So if you read the theory chapter of this book, you'll see that we engage into multiple dialogues with historians, sociologists, anthropologists, economists. But this is what we typically saw in the literature. Not necessarily by historians, not necessarily but by anthropologists, but indeed in sociology, in criminology, and in economics. This idea that crime and state belong to different spheres. There were not just two assumptions here. One assumption was that state and crime were homogeneous groups or homogeneous spheres, but also that they were independent. Many arguments that we came across were arguments about the relationship, the zero-sum relationship between the state and organized crime. This idea that the greater the state presence, the smaller the sphere of organized crime, and vice versa. This was very much ingrained in most of the literature that we looked into, this idea of state actors as law enforcement agents, that whenever they were capable of crushing organized crime, they would be able to push this horizontal line down, and under conditions of state weakness or where states had collapsed, organized crime would push up that horizontal line. We found these not very useful theoretically, and specifically when we engage publics of victims, publics in Mexico and other parts of Latin America. When we showed these two figures, people showed deep dissatisfaction. But not when we started speaking this language. When we started showing this type of Venn diagrams in which the spheres of crime and state intersect and create a gray zone of criminality, this is when people would say, yes, that's what it looks like. People in Acapulco, people in Ciudad Juarez, people in different parts of Mexico would say that's more like the realities we engage, and that's the zone where we are, that gray zone, where we battle between state and criminal actors. So most of the study looks very deeply into how this gray zone emerges and how it works. So let me walk you very quickly through some of these key ideas. This gray zone of criminality where state actors and criminal actors intersect. This is the ecosystem where we claim organized criminal groups can emerge and can live and reproduce. One of the big statements in this figure is that state and criminal actors are not homogeneous groups. On the right-hand side, you can identify state actors that may collude with organized crime or with crime and would constitute organized criminal groups, but those state agents that do not. And on the left-hand side, you can see that there's crime, ordinary crime, and then there's organized crime. So for us, this became crucial to identify this ecosystem. But the second one is that our emphasis is not on all state actors. So members of ministries of education or health are not necessarily intersecting here and not so relevant for crime and for organized crime as partners. But particularly our emphasis is on state security forces, on what we call state specialists in violence. And what we say is that these type of gray zones of criminality, while they exist in democracies and autocracies, they tend to emerge in autocracies. And when they emerge in autocracies, they involve specifically the state security sector. So let me go to the next slide to start bringing the actors into the gray zone. We identify the military, the police, and the Secret Service, which tend to be the most prominent actors in the not only in terms of governance in authoritarian regimes, but these are actors who actually whose mandate is to repress political dissidents. Autocrats typically provide them with lots of information. These are highly trained individuals in the art of coercion. And these are folks and groups and institutions that receive lots of impunity. Now, one of the problems in terms of governance that we discuss in the book is that many of these actors we haven't identified here, but you also have other types of forces like paramilitary forces or death squads, which are part of this security sector in autocracies. Many of these groups actually can get very powerful in suppressing political dissidents. One of the dilemmas that autocrats typically face is how to keep them in control. And what we discuss in the book, using lots of historical examples, mostly from Latin America, is that autocrats typically engage into a transaction by which they secure the loyalty of these groups, which can actually be as powerful as to conduct a coup, but they keep their loyalty by allowing them to profit from the criminal underworld. So we provide lots of examples in autocracies in Latin America, military autocracies, one-party regimes, personalistic autocracies, in which members of the Secret Service, the military and the police from Bolivia in the 1970s to Chile in the 1970s, in the 1980s, to Panama in the 80s, Mexico in the 1980s, Cuba under Batista. There's many different examples of military, police, and Secret Service actors who are allowed to engage into the criminal underworld and to become protectors or regulators of illicit markets, actors that are absolutely crucial, whose protection is absolutely crucial for criminal groups to constitute themselves as organized criminal groups and to thrive in illicit markets. So bottom line, for us, one of the key claims is that organized criminal groups can only exist and thrive to the extent that they engage or they have some form of systematic engagement with state specialists in violence. So for us, at this point, the language of organized criminal groups as private groups is behind, or the idea that the spheres of state and crime are separate spheres, that politics is irrelevant. What I've done so far and what we do in the book is we introduce political regimes and we introduce a logic by which this type of relationships emerge in autocracies. In the case of Mexico, we go specifically and take advantage of very important work that is in the making or that has emerged in recent years that really looks at how these relationships developed in the 1970s and 80s, way before the starting point of democratization. We substantiate in the book how while initially it was the military, the police, and the Secret Service who played a key role in regulating and reconstituting drug trafficking in Mexico in the 70s and 80s, we build on the work of historians. But we do identify important changes that I'll talk about on coercion. It was no longer the military. There was a process of decentralization of coercion that affected dynamics of drug trafficking. But I want you to keep this image in mind and then introduce the question of what happens when countries transition to democracy, keeping this type of relationships. So let me just for a moment pause and ask that question. So what happens when a country before transitioning to democracy has this gray zone, this extensive gray zone, this set of relationships? We don't have them on the figure, but these type of relationships are upheld mainly, specifically the impunity part, by judicial systems, by court systems, by lawyers and attorneys and judges that provide this impunity. So this is a complex system, that involves not only the security sector, but also the judicial system. Now, the key question is when countries transition to democracy, one of the key questions is what do you do with this repressive past and with these repressive actors? And what we claim, building on other research I am conducting with colleagues Lucia Tiscornia and Juan Albarracin, is that when countries transition to democracy and only adopt electoral competition, but do not engage into transitional justice processes by which they look into a repressive past and provide evidence of atrocities committed by the security sector, they are more likely to allow this type of relationships to prevail. By the same token, when countries transition to democracy without enacting major security sector reforms or major changes in the judiciary, we claim in this book, they are more likely to transition with this type of relationships. Now, the problem is that when countries transition into thin illiberal democracies, so these are thin transitions. This is what Terry Lynn Carl in the 1990s, looking at the case of El Salvador, identified as electoralism. This obsession that many of us, including in Mexico, political elites had in the 1990s, that if you only adopted free and fair elections, everything else would follow. Well, what we'll see in the case of Mexico, like Honduras, like Brazil, somehow like El Salvador, is one of those cases of countries that transitioned to electoral democracy and built a liberal democracy in which there was electoral competition, but no democratic rule of law. It's a very different experience than one that Chile lived, or Peru lived, or Bolivia lived. Countries that did not surrender on the idea of looking into the past, countries that adopted transitional justice processes and that engage into long-term reforms into the security sector. These are the ones that transition with a much thinner gray zones of criminality and in which elections did not become a trigger of violence. Let me show the last theoretical slide. And this is when we introduced political shocks into the equation. So the question is, what happens when a country like Mexico transitions into democracy? When you start having electoral competition, alternation, party alternation, when parties win and lose? Well, that creates, we would say, on the democratic side, good outcomes. Competition allows for accountability, for greater responsiveness, we've assumed for a long time. But when we look at what happens in the gray zone of criminality, what this entails is democracy and alternation of parties in office entails removing chiefs of police, attorney generals at different levels, and that introduces great uncertainty in the gray zone of criminality and triggering incentives for conflict and violence. What we look into the book is different moments. I'll talk about one of those moments, and Sandra will talk about the two other moments in which this happened in Mexico. Subnational alternation, will claim, introduced a great degree of uncertainty among the type of relationships that specialists in violence had developed with organized criminal groups. And as a result, organized criminal groups had to prepare themselves, created their private militias to protect their turf and to conquer rival territories. So sadly, and this is one of the key claims, at least theoretically, and we'll show empirically that this is the case, that when countries transition to thin illiberal democracies, that is lots of electoral competition, but not democratic rule of law. And this gray zone of criminality and these sort of relationships that you see on the screen prevail, electoral mechanisms, some electoral politics is likely to become intimately intertwined with dynamics in the gray zone of criminality and become triggers, catalyst of political violence. And it's not just electoral competition and party alternation. We also look into the decentralization of political power, the fragmentation of power, political plurality, different forms of plurality that we typically associate with good outcomes in democracy, sadly become triggers of violence in this type of democracies. So let me go to the Mexican case and just tackle the first question. Sandra will tackle the two other questions. So why did cartels go to war in Mexico? This is an image of 4 of the main cartels that emerged from the 1970s and 80s. Again, extensive government involvement through the secret police in crafting these 4 cartels that were dominant in the 80s by the time of the cocaine boom of the 80s and 90s. What we know is that this is the period that historians call the Pax Mafiosa, in which there was some stability, there was no systematic violence. But this ended in the 1990s. What you have is data on murders, executions by year until 2006. Keep in mind that 2006 is important because most of the discussion about drug violence in Mexico is associated to the war on drugs that was initially launched in 2006, or the more contemporary version of the war on drugs that was launched in 2006. What this figure shows is that cartels went to war at least a decade and a half prior to the war on drugs. So why did cartels go to war? Here you have battle deaths of approximately 250 in the 90s, 250 annual battle deaths. By 2005, 2006, Mexico was beyond the threshold of 1,000 battle deaths per year. What we want to call your attention to is dynamics of subnational political change. Mexico's transition to democracy is known to be a federalist transition to democracy that began in cities and states and eventually led to a party alternation in Mexico City and in the country as a whole. What's a little bit sad in this story, we believe, is I'm here with the upper left panel, identifying with the map Baja California, the first place where the PRI, the party that ruled Mexico for 7 decades, lost power. And that's where the first intercartel war began. So what I'm going to walk you through very quickly is experiences of party alternation, Baja California here on the left, boom, intercartel wars. Second major experience of alternation, Chihuahua, boom, intercartel wars, the outbreak of wars. Jalisco, Nuevo León here, Michoacán and Guerrero. So what we do in the paper, we claim is that this is the first empirical part of the book, is that subnational party alternation led to the breakdown of protection. When a new governor came in, removed the state attorney general, the chief of the state police, key actors that were at the central nodes of protection in the gray zone of criminality. Let me reemphasize, Mexico, starting 85, experienced a process of decentralization of coercion. Most state attorney generals and state judicial police in the late 80s and 90s became the coercive branch of Mexico's authoritarian regime. And at the same time, they were the ones who were providing protection for cartels. Subnational party alternation and the breakdown of protection led to a period of uncertainty and vulnerability among cartels, who reacted by creating their own private militias. This is new, and went to war. This is evidence, time series, cross-sectional or panel models. We're just showing here the impact of state alternation. On average, a state experiencing party alternation experienced 75% more violence than a state that did not undergo. Let me take one step back. A municipality in a state that experienced state alternation, on average, experienced 75% more violence than a municipality from a state that did not. All the other factors that you see here on the figure, it's just to recognize that we engage in a very extensive discussion with the sociology and economics of crime and recognize other types of literature. But we want to single out the omitted bias due to the traditional absence of political factors, which here seem to have a substantively important effect. Now, this type of dynamics, we provide quasi-experimental models to show that this was not just a correlation, but that state alternation was actually a cause. We use synthetic control methods to do that. I'm coming to an end in the presentation, at least my part, just to show that this is party alternation had a very important impact in the industrial organization of Mexico's drug trafficking industry. This is what the cartels looked like in the past, family businesses. And this is what the cartels look like after party alternation. Very complex structures. This is just a stylized figure where you had the drug lord and the family who created private armies, and those private armies were complex militias with chiefs of army, their lieutenants. Many of them were defectors from the armed forces or the police, the federal police, the state police, actors who were deployed subnationally. Subnational politics is crucial in the book. And that has to do with historical reasons, but also for theoretical reasons. We define lots of terms. So one of the key definitions that we introduce is our understanding of the drug trafficking industry as a global trade of local operations. So subnational actors were crucial here. These chiefs of army were either members of the state judicial police or members of the armed forces and the federal police who were deployed locally. So they typically defected and became chiefs of army. Plaza chiefs also, these are the people, mostly guys, who were in charge of controlling the business and controlling populations, territories at the city level. Those were the plaza chiefs. And the foot soldiers often were members of street gangs, young males, young men ages 15 to 35, who probably represent the largest chunk of people who've been killed in these wars. Let me just leave you with this image. Violence, this is what violence looked like. Murders associated to organized criminal groups in Mexico accumulated 2000 and 2006. This is what President Calderon received in 2006 by the time he declared the war on drugs. What Sandra is going to go through is how the war on drugs led to a dramatic increase in violence. But I would just emphasize that by the time Calderon declared the war on drugs, there was a long prior history to it. The cartels had been to war for nearly a decade and a half. This doesn't mean that we justify the war, but there was a history that we cannot ignore and that sadly Calderon ignored. Sandra?
Thank you. Thanks again to the UVRN and to King's College for the invitation. We're really honored by the invitation. And let me see. There. And I want to continue this this conversation and where Guillermo left it, to address what is the third part of the book, where we seek to explain why did the state's war against cartels intensify violence precisely in that point where Guillermo dropped this last slide referring to the war on drugs initiated by Felipe Calderon. So as probably all of you know, President Calderon declared the war on drugs after Mexico's most competitive presidential election. It was a margin of victory of less than 1% in the context of acute political polarization between the right and left, and I'll go into what this polarization looked like and what was the logic behind it. But it was in this context that President Calderon deployed or launched 16 military campaigns across the country to the most conflicted regions, and violence has skyrocketed. There are several brilliant works by colleagues in different parts of the world that have been actually working on what has been the effect of these military campaigns and what has been the effect of militarization, showing very clearly that it has had it led to the a consistent and wide increase of violence, and dissecting different different mechanisms that link militarization and violence. Whatever mechanism we may go through, the fact is that violence is skyrocketed. And so in just 6 years between 2007 and 2012, this is a map that Guillermo showed you in the last slide, but the following 6 years, violence increased by a factor of 5. The federal intervention had a really dramatic effect, and there was a particular intensification of violence in 3 focal points. So the Gulf, the center north, and the center. So we really see an explosion of violence. It's no longer about the northern part of the country or it being about drug trafficking routes. This is a larger phenomenon. So the argument that we developed for understanding this first increase in violence is we move beyond the military intervention in Mexico, which indeed took place in a profound political polarization process, but we move beyond the militarization and we seek to understand the political logic behind it. So if we go back in time in the logic of Mexican history and the party system, what we see is that under authoritarianism in the 1990s, under the PRI rule, there were of course important differences between the PRD, the left, and the PAN being the right government, the right party in Mexico. And despite the differences between PAN and PRD, they shared a desire for free and fair elections, and this created a space for cooperation. However, in the post-authoritarian period, there were economic, sociocultural dimensions that became the battleground for confrontation between the PRD left and PAN, the right party. There was partisan conflict that started to arise around economic issues, sociocultural dimensions. Partisan conflict, however, really reached a peak when López Obrador, current president of Mexico, became subject to impeachment just 1 year before the presidential election. So this really began to polarize the two parties, as there were beginning to be obstacles for the PRD to continue growing electorally. And when President Calderon won the presidency by the smallest margin in Mexican history, below 1%, the left, the PRD, did not recognize his electoral victory. And so it was in this context, of this polarized context, that Calderon's military interventions took place. So as I said, what we do in the book is move beyond militarization and explore the politicization of the intervention. As Guillermo emphasized in the first part of the presentation, the background conditions on which our argument is working is this context of an illiberal democracy that fails to limit presidential power, where the rule of law is very weak, and against this backdrop of acute political polarization, a military intervention, then we argue, reflects these political divisions. So in vertically integrated political regions, national and subnational co-partisan authorities, since they all share the same party, they can cooperate, they can share information about what's going on. Local governments in this process then can become empowered. Even if their jurisdiction does not allow them to actually persecute organized crime activity, the fact is that they have greater resources, greater support, and they can become empowered to confront cartels and effectively contain violence. However, the story is not the same when there's partisan vertical fragmentation, when different levels of government are controlling the municipal, the state, and the national governments. The president, what happens in this process is that it's not cooperating with subnational authorities, largely leaving the local authorities unprotected and vulnerable to violence. Cartels then can take the advantage take advantage of this political polarization and try to conquer new markets and territories. So what we are saying here is that cartels can actually read the political environment and take advantage of this context. So in the particular case of Mexico, what we were saying is the national government initiating this military intervention, but not really in a process of communication, cooperation with opposition parties, but not only the opposition at large, but in our argument is focusing specifically about how the right was specifically confronted with the left party. So what we do here is we analyze again panel data at the municipal level, and what you're seeing here is the first label in this graph refers to the party of the national government, which was PAN, the Felipe Calderon's party. The second label refers to the governor's party, the state level party, and the third label refers to the municipal party, the party that's governing at the mayor level. So what we find is that municipalities in PAN-dominated states, the first two lines that you're seeing here, actually experience lower levels of violence than the rest of the country, regardless of the party in control of the municipality. The most violent municipalities were opposition municipalities in leftist states. So being led by the PRD at the state level. And even if we look at municipalities that have the same degree of fragmentation, here PAN, PRD, PRI, and above PRI, PRD. So thinking, well, whether maybe this is just about the level of fragmentation that we see. No, it was really about the PRD, the left governing at the state level, that yields nearly 12 times more criminal violence in this context. So we could think perhaps that maybe there is something particular about the left governing. Maybe there is something particular about those places where the left ended up governing at the local level. What we do to address this potential concerns is conduct natural experiments and compare the evolution of intercartel violence across a number of municipalities located along state borders of two western states in Mexico, Michoacán and Jalisco. And despite having the multiple similarities across neighboring municipalities in these two states, historical, socioeconomic, cultural, an important difference is that Michoacán was governed by the PRD, the left party, while Jalisco was governed by the right party, had a PAN governor. President Calderon worked really closely with the PAN governor in Jalisco with his co-partisan in 2007-2013. But in Michoacán, this wasn't the case. In fact, the federal intervention in this process, there was no dialogue between military and state security forces, and leading to a twofold difference in the number of drug-related murders along these two sets of neighboring municipalities. In fact, something that really caught our attention as we were continued working in this project early since 2008, 2009, we started to see a peak in the rise of attacks by organized crime against mayors and local authorities, particularly in the case of Michoacán, where this was a phenomenon that was starting to catch the attention of many scholars and experts. And so as an additional question that we ask ourselves in this book is, why do cartels murder mayors and local party candidates? What we were seeing is that between 1995 and 2006, there were really only a few attacks. After 2006, however, there was a wave of high-profile criminal violence that really reached a peak in 2010, 2011. this is puzzling because you wouldn't expect cartels necessarily to be calling attention towards them through these very high-profile attacks. We saw that these attacks were mainly concentrated among municipal level officials and party candidates. So over 80% of these attacks were directed towards local actors. And these were occurring more so during local election cycles. So what you're seeing in your screens is that the dotted lines refer to the years in which there were local elections in these 4 different states that we explore at a deeper level along the book. And as you can see in Chihuahua, in Guerrero, you can see that these election cycles tend to be highly correlated with an increase of attacks by organized crime against political candidates and against local authorities. And as I said, Michoacán, the state of Michoacán, was particularly troublesome because it had, up to now, it has had the most violent election in Mexican history, local election in Mexican history. And it is important to note, however, that organized crime does not target one municipality at a time. As you can see, it tends to target entire regions. So there is also a logic of territoriality in this process. So again, why do cartels murder mayors and local party candidates? What we argue in the book is that when drug cartels are engaged in this intense turf wars, fighting for these territories, drug lords have incentives to launch attacks against local government officials and political actors to gain protection, to capture public rents, to control government structures, to control local populations and territories. As you can see through this process, what we are describing is that there was a strong confrontation between cartels, but also against the Mexican state. And so in this process, this was no longer about drug trafficking. There was a diversification of activities that needed to take place in order to finance these wars. But at the same time, drug lords also ordered attacks when it is possible to do so. As I showed in the previous slides, there were circumstances that were making authorities vulnerable and unprotected, particularly where political power is vertically fragmented. The decision to leave certain political actors, political local authorities unprotected had very important consequences in the way that these attacks played out. Cartels also took advantage of these opportunities to colonize governments, such as during local election cycles. Ultimately, through these attacks, groups, as I said, are looking for territorial control and will therefore also attack neighboring municipalities. Ultimately, through this process, whether it is about these different explanations, they are all leading to ultimate end for organized crime, which is the establishment of criminal governance regimes. And this is what we devote the last part of our of the book, to understand the logic of criminal governance and how it has been transforming the way in which democracy is being actually experienced at the local level in Mexico. A growing number of scholars in recent years has been exploring the logic of criminal governance, has been understanding and conceptualizing. A very recent paper by Benjamin Lessing goes into this concept of criminal governance that many others have been also working on, understanding this transformation of organized crime, establishing de facto controls over different dimensions of local life, such as political, economic, and social life of neighborhoods and districts in urban areas. This is organized crime groups' attempt to influence electoral processes, to capture public rents, to monitor and manipulate civilian organization. So again, what we do is now working with a different dependent variable, that it's no longer about murders associated with organized crime, but a more complex dependent variable, which refers to attacks by organized crime against political authorities and political candidates. What we taking these attacks, which include threats, kidnappings, disappearances, murders, we confirm again that partisan intergovernmental conflict between a conservative president and leftist state governors affected mayors and local candidates in left-led states, who then became likely targets of attacks because murder became a relatively cheaper alternative method or mechanism of criminal control than bribes. Again, while we look into this effort of natural experiments, and we find that despite numerous similarities that we can observe in two bordering states, this time Michoacán and Guerrero, both in southeast Mexico, this region Tierra Caliente that has become the focus of a lot of drug trafficking activity and growing criminal activity. We see again that despite similarities in sociodemographics, geography, and cartel activity, similar groups working in these areas, we find that their distinct electoral candidates had a major effect on high-profile criminal attacks. In 2011, we had an election year in Michoacán, and it exhibited 8 times more attacks than in Guerrero, where in Guerrero, there were no such election cycles. This tells us that indeed, local electoral cycles are moments in time that cartels take advantage of to start to seize local governments. Throughout part 4 of the book, that we can talk more about in Q&A, we document how organized crime has indeed transformed local life, seizing electoral processes, colonizing municipal governments, seating mayors one by one, asking them for 10% of their budgets, controlling local economies, establishing prices for specific agricultural products, or expanding the extortion market, and establishing territorial controls, which has included the displacement of thousands across the country, the disappearance of local leaders, of journalists. Ultimately, what we achieve also through this book is that we can contribute to a political science of organized crime that can inform a democratic security policy. We would like to stress three main lessons. One, that rather than focusing on criminal bosses, democratic elites should focus on identifying and removing authoritarian specialists in violence who are at the center of the state criminal networks that Guillermo was describing at the beginning of this conversation. Second, that a key element in the reform of security and judicial institution is the depoliticization of law enforcement, while at the same time making security forces more transparent and subject to civilian oversight. What I have described in my part of the presentation is precisely the consequences of when presidential power is not limited, of what happens when, despite changes in democratic politics, it is possible to reconfigure those protection networks that existed in the authoritarian past. And finally, that this failure to reform authoritarian sources of power has had devastating effects of the evolution of democracy. This is not only about a violence taking place, this is about how democracy is changing, how democracy at the local level, in fact, has become corrupted, but to a level where this is no longer about just some politicians being captured by organized crime, but about organized crime, in fact, taking control and transforming any kind of possible democratic experience that citizens may be able to have at the very local level. Thank you all, and we look forward to the questions and conversation.
Thank you so much to both of you. It's fascinating and really important research, particularly for a lot of our CSD students this week. We've actually have a session on the political economy of war. And this is incredibly relevant. There are many of us also from the urban violence side who've been researching criminal governance, but have come at this from the study of civil wars, where we're quite familiar with the idea of collusion and the fact that, seeing these groups as, purely criminal or as apolitical, as Guillermo pointed out, is really unhelpful. But I've not seen any research really that has gone in this level of depth to look at what happens with the interaction with the political system at the subnational level. The last slide is the really important one for me, because the findings are great, and it's really about the policy and the practical implications, and some of the perverse findings in a way about the effects of democratization. So it's really, really thought-provoking and really important research. Now, for those of you who want to ask questions, we already have some questions in the box, but if you want to ask a question, you can type it into the Q&A box. I'm going to risk trying something new, and rather than asking the question myself, I'm going to try and enable the speakers to ask the question themselves. Apparently I can allow you to talk. So the first question we have is from Raul. So Raul, I don't know if you're able to speak, but if you can't, I will ask for you.
Hi, I think the video is not on, but doesn't matter. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, yeah.
We can.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you very much, Kieran. As you know, I'm doing my PhD here in King's in War Studies. So I found your book and the articles when you were publishing them quite interesting, because I see, rather than a breakup or this debate of where was the onset of the criminal war in Mexico that we are currently experiencing, rather than a historical process of their conflict itself. So I really appreciate this view that you have done, that Luis Astorga was doing before, and now you're bringing with new ideas and research. And I wanted to make a really sharp question. Maybe some of the students that are here listen or read news and have seen that recently the Minister of Defense of Mexico, well, the former Minister, Salvador Cienfuegos, and the Minister of Public Security during Calderon, the one that began the war, Genaro Garcia Luna, were detained in the US, both for accounts on drug trafficking by the DEA. Besides that, besides the politics of the bilateral relation, some commentators will jump on and say, like, this is a proof, general argument that this is like the conspiracy of how there is a narco state, and how they use the case of Afghanistan for a long time to argue that Mexico is kind of a narco state and all the elites are entwined in this. So this thing it's posing a challenge for us to research to Mexico, to make a nuanced answer. What would be the one from you? And thank you very much for being here with us.
So please, whoever would like to take this on first, please go ahead.
So thank you, Raul, for the observation and the question. We truly appreciate that, and we read your work, you cite your work, so it's great to see you as part of this engagement. What I would say is that the reason why we need to go back to theory is because what I would respond to people who are saying Mexico is a narco state is to go back to those Venn diagrams. And really, when you say Mexico is a narco state, it really means that the two spheres completely overlap. And to be honest with you, that's very hard to happen. I mean, theoretically, it's a very rare moment when the two spheres overlap, but empirically it doesn't happen. The two spheres can overlap by a lot, and that's a different matter. And I think in the Mexican case, there's a huge overlap. What we need to understand is that states are heterogeneous actors, not homogeneous actors, and that organized crime and organized criminal groups are also heterogeneous. There's all kinds of engagements and different types of relationships. And you cannot say what matters is what happens at the municipal level or the state level or the national level. It depends. It depends of the historical time period in Mexico, and it depends on the country. So for some countries, it might be the generals at the top. For others, it might be governors. For others, it would be mayors. But I think what's important is to keep in mind the different layers: global, national, subnational. And let me just say one final thing about this. Something that troubles me about the US actually following these policies of extradition, or simply unilaterally going into a country to do the research and then eventually detaining someone like the former Minister of Defense. And the way the Mexican government has reacted is that for all practical purposes, Mexico is outsourcing. When I hear the president say, no, we will not conduct any investigation, we'll wait to see what the New York City courts decide. That's when you are surrendering justice. And I think that's part of the problem that we've discussed, Sandra and I here, a transition to democracy that it's just electoral, and that presidents of the right and now presidents of the left have given up on surrendering on the powers they have and reforming the judicial system. So what I would love to see is a Mexican investigation on these matters, because the US courts are only interested in drug trafficking and money laundering. But if you go back into the history of the General Cienfuegos, he has deep roots in the drug wars that we discussed when he was deployed locally in Guerrero, as you know very well, because this is a region that you work, Tierra Caliente, when he was commander of different military zones, military regions. He played a very important role engaging, providing protection for organized criminal groups, specifically for the Beltran Leyva organization. So we need to get into those type of deep understandings, not just assume that because he was a Minister of Defense that collusion happens at the national level. You have to go back in history, trace back how these network relationships happen. And often it is the case that you will have to go local, but not just local, remain there. Again, subnational, national, global, it's the analysis at the three levels, at multiple levels, and always avoiding this temptation of having the easy and lazy conclusion that this is an narco state. These are complex relationships among actors who belong to heterogeneous spheres. Sandra, you want to add anything?
Yeah, thanks again, Raul. It's a pleasure to find you in this other spaces for discussion, and we really appreciate your careful reading always. My reaction to as I was reading your question, Raul, in the first place was that we've become the state capture is sort of like what in the moment was a failed states concept, that it falls short to capturing really what's happening and to understanding the different how this is a deeper transformation and the intertwining of the state and organized crime. I think that these other concepts fail to understand how democracy has transformed, but at the same time how this calls to the to inertial forces that have been accompanying us. And so I think that's where we have to be more careful about our concepts and about their implications, because this is no, to think about capture, to think about corruption, it falls short from what we're seeing right now. And to the extent that we're now seeing a former Ministry of Security with this, with going through these accusations and trials, I think that precisely speaks to how deeply connected different channels have gone through in the state that we're not really talking about capture as such. And at the same time that I think that we have to look also into how those processes feel into the local level. I think that we should not forget about the local logic of organized crime and how that speaks to as Guillermo was saying, also local and national level processes that have to be accompanied in terms of the transformation of judicial and security institutions.
Excellent. Thank you both for those answers. Domitilla Sagramoso, I think you have a question. You have your hand up. So do you want to?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I only see a black screen, so I hope you're there, all of you all. Thank you. It was really fascinating. I have a question regarding methodology and how, I mean, it seems you did a very good sort of quantitative analysis, gathering a lot of data on acts of violence and on political change. I was wondering if you managed to do also qualitative analysis at local level, interviewing people, having sort of more direct information of particular realities as a result of sort of contacts on the ground and interviews, because I think that could enrich a lot sort of the quantitative analysis that is so interesting that you've conducted. And then, if I may, Guillermo, I would like to ask you, I mean, you start off interestingly talking about, you know, authoritarian transition. I presume you're talking about the monopoly of power of PRI. I'm not an expert on Mexican politics, but I presume that's what you had in mind. And therefore, my question is, when levels of violence are strong, to what extent representatives of the PRI are still part of this sort of old regime? And it's no longer so much a sort of right or left, but a struggle also with those groups or parties that had links that were very strong with organized crime, as you seem to assume, that there is very strong links between security structures and criminal organizations. So I'm wondering if you can say a bit more about sort of the political nature of this transition and what you mean exactly by it, and to what extent elements of this old regime, between brackets, you know, who are still around and who have ties with organized crime, are also part and parcel of this violence and of this challenge that is conducted against organized crime. Thank you.
Sandra, you want to start?
Yeah, I can start off with the first question. Thank you so much for the question. We indeed, what we engage in through a mixed methods approach, gathering data from newspapers, building different data sets, original data sets on organized crime, violence in Mexico, looking specifically into murders committed by organized crime groups. We also construct data sets on this is specific attacks of organized crime against political actors. But indeed, something that was very important for us was to speak to some very important relevant actors and understand specifically the logic of how those in power at the moment were experiencing these processes. So in the first part of the book that Guillermo described, something that was very important was to actually talk to governors of the first opposition governors in Mexico. So in the book, there's information from interviews with the first opposition governor in Baja California, in Michoacán, in Jalisco. We also have conversations with leftist governors through the Calderon era, but we also talk to mayors in that were actually living in this situation of vulnerability. There's also a lot that very bright and courageous investigative journalists have been documented for a long time, and so there's also a lot of their voice that comes through in that process. But we did talk to a wide number of local and national and state level actors to understand both the logic of the strategy at the national level, talking to some of the members of the staff, of the intelligence staff in Calderon's group, and also talking to opposition actors at different levels of government. And Guillermo, would you like to address the second question?
So just to complement one minor point on Sandra's response, it's crucial to understand that who we needed to talk to, and we needed to talk to partly because this is a book, this is a project about the impact of party alternation, the impact of intergovernmental relationships, attacks against mayors. We had to talk to political actors. We had to talk, as Sandra said, former governors, mayors, some heartbreaking, very complicated interviews with families of mayors who had been killed. We talked to extensively, and we've interacted on a personal basis, and also as members of civil society with many human rights NGOs, and we've had a very extensive engagement both with journalists, investigative journalists. So we, the architecture of the book is there's a theory chapter, and then each of the three sections of the book has a quantitative analysis that is observational, quantitative analysis followed by quasi-experimental analysis. But then each one of these thirds is the quantitative analysis followed by case studies that draw on ethnographic interviews, but also on history. We really show the evolution of actors across time and space, sometimes focusing specifically on cities. So contrasting Tijuana, Juarez, and Apatzingan, the type of analysis that Sandra showed across borders. So there's a lot of zooming in. Domitila, you're absolutely right. If we don't hear the voices of actors, now the key question is which actors do you need to analyze, and that depends on the type of book. I'll just be very brief on the nature of the political transition. Yes, we speak about 7 decades of one-party rule that came to an end at the national level in 2000, but that this process of pluralization began at least a decade earlier when governors, opposition governors came into office. And a lot of the subnational story has to do with that. One key element is that indeed, there's continuity. We speak about legacies and continuities of actors, PRI affiliated actors. But the fact of the matter is that cartels, once they create their private militias, they are able to renegotiate the terms of protection with opposition governors. So this is a story in which democracy becomes, and democratic actors, democratically elected actors became intimately intertwined with organized crime of all political actors, of all political parties, of all ideological colors. So while there's a long legacy of the PRI, what we see is that there's different forms of victimization. The fact that during a specific period of time, leftist mayors were victimized doesn't mean that there were different forms of engagement and corruption of leftist subnational political actors. Same thing happened with pan-political actors. So it's not just the PRI, and this is the part that is very complex, that little by little, there's a subversion of subnational democracy that Sandra talked about, and this is happening across different parties. The last thing I would emphasize is the continuity of practices. So more than thinking, oh, the Peristas are here, and we suffer that. When Peña Nieto and the PRI came back at the national level, there were very high levels of corruption that we hadn't seen among other actors. But I want to emphasize, and we emphasize in the book, continuities in terms of practices, in terms of practices in the military, the playbook of the military, the anti-insurgency policies that they learned and practiced in the 70s during the Dirty War, just survived over time to this day. Similar practices in the police forces. So it's not just the continuity of parties, the continuity of people, but I think what's most important is the continuity of practices, because you don't reform institutions. So this is not just a story about elections and parties. this is the interaction in the context, in a context in which you do not reform the military, the police, and the judicial system. This tends to happen, and this affects all political parties of all ideological colors.
Thank you. Duncan, you have a question. I don't know if you're able to ask it directly.
Yes, thank you very much. I fear I know very little about Mexico, and I do hope my questions will not sound terribly naive. But I was wondering why it should be that vertical political fragmentation necessarily results in vulnerability in terms of the security of local politicians. And thinking in particular about the political faction controlling the national government currently, and whether they would anticipate being in just as vulnerable a position if the balance of power changed nationally. And if so, would they not find this situation intolerably precarious? What is the obstacle to establishing a cross-partisan norm that mayors, regardless of their party affiliation, are equally deserving of effective police protection?
Thank you so much for the question, Duncan. It's not a naive question at all. I think it speaks precisely to a key element that we emphasize in the conditions leading to our argument, and that Guillermo was referring at the end of the answer to Domitila, it is a puzzle. It is a puzzle that how is it that and I guess that's how the book started, actually, thinking of all of this desirable effects or phenomena within democratization, thinking about competition, alternation, decentralization. How is it that these things that we thought that should be desirable, leading towards accountability, are actually leading to some very unfavorable and undesirable outcomes? And so, as Guillermo was saying before, the key element here is the lack of reform of security forces, the judicial structures, and a very weak rule of law that really didn't put a limit to presidential power. I think that is a first element that we must take into consideration to how is it that fragmentation could lead to these outcomes. But at the same time, there's an additional element here that you're pointing at, Duncan, in terms of the electoral logic. And something that is puzzling in this process is that parties were blaming each other back and forth. This is the national government. We have to the responsible agent here is the national government for not doing his job, and at the same time the national government was saying, no, this is a problem of the municipal or the state forces or the state governor or the mayor, because they're corrupt and they're having all these dealings with organized crime. And in this process, it was really hard for voters to understand what was going on and who to blame. So there's a huge responsibility attribution process that actually made it really hard for voters to attribute responsibility and then vote accordingly. So it wasn't as clear that it was gonna have terrible electoral consequences, because it was really hard for voters to pinpoint what was going on. If you look at different works that have studies that have been looking exactly at the electoral consequences, we see that accountability for violence is very, very low in the Mexican case, at least.
Thank you.
What I would say, just to follow up, because I think it's a very profound question, and just to build on what Sandra responded. I think what this finding really tells us is that in the war on drugs, in the Mexican war on drugs, we've talked a lot and we've criticized, and there's plenty of evidence criticizing the deployment of the military for purposes of public security. And there's a huge literature on analyzing the negative effects of this, as Sandra said. But then there's a question of partisanship and the question of why politicizing this. And there was a backlash by 2008, 2009. Initially, the deployment of the army kind of worked. Levels of violence decreased, but there was a huge backlash. And the question was there, in the context of you're waging a war, the state is waging a war in a context of deep ideological polarization, as Sandra explained in her presentation. Well, there's this temptation, and this is something we've seen, Stephen Wilkinson's book on India, the partisan use of the police to protect Muslims against Hindu violence in context in which Muslims represented a pivotal electorate. And where they did not, you don't protect them. What we show here, it's a very perverse moment in Mexico's political history, by which Calderón actually politicizes the deployment of the army to work together with his co-partisans. And I think we have to underline, as we do in the book, and to punish his political enemies, specifically his nemesis, the left, the party that did not recognize him as the legitimate president of Mexico. And you'll find in the book plenty of stories of how this is strategic vulnerability of mayors. Mayors have access to very weak police forces. Mayors don't have the judicial, the policy power to confront some of these groups, organized criminal groups, with private militias that are actually quite powerful. Some of the most powerful paramilitary groups, the Zetas, for example, it's impossible for a mayor to actually confront them. You need to have some level of cooperation and assistance from the federal government. And this is something that affects federal system, presidential federal systems in context of polarization. Just think about Donald Trump right now. Why is it that he's working with Republican governors, sadly for those populations, because the level of COVID are going to the roof, but also punishing and questioning his the opposition Democratic governors. Think about what happened with the governor of Michigan. When President Trump actually says, well, there was an attempt to kidnap the governor of Michigan, it's because she was leftist. Rather than protect and say something about the governor and say it's impossible to think that in the US today, a right-wing militia or a white militia, a white supremacist group might try to adopt the governor of Michigan. Well, that's the type of dynamics that we saw in Mexico during the war on drugs. That Calderón and his people, specifically Raúl mentioned a former public security defense, Garcia Luna. This is the guy who specialized in staging, literally staging, and they would just instrumentalize and use the Attorney General's office just to go out on national television and say, hey, look, the stigma, these leftist mayors are under attack because they're probably colluded. So they had no evidence of that, but they politicized that. And ultimately, theoretically, what this shows to us is that the idea that we've had for nearly a century about that state agents would seek the monopoly of violence within a given territory. We have evidence here, very clear evidence, that Calderón was not hoping to have the monopoly of violence. He was hoping to have the monopoly of violence in some parts of Mexico where his co-partisans rule, but not where the left rule. He was willing to accept that violence and then blame it onto them.
Thank you both. I thought we were going to get through a session without Donald Trump rearing his head, but that was that's a really interesting point that you make there. Really important point as well. Juan, you have a question about the Latin American context and broader applicability. Juan, are you able to ask, or I can ask for you? Okay. I will read that question. So Juan says, thanks very much to both of you for the fascinating presentation. I'd like to ask you a question about the novel political theory of organized crime that you propose. how can we define the political approach of organized criminal groups that are especially involved in extremely violent repertoires that refuse to negotiate with the state? Although I know that your book studies the Mexican experience, I think that your approach can be adopted to understand other contexts in Latin America.
Sandra, you wanna?
Yeah, thank you to Juan for his question. One of the reactions that we've had, it's interesting to read Juan's comment, because one of the reactions that we've had sometimes it's, well, in fact, violence, activity by organized crime does not necessarily have to be this violent, right? We've seen places like, for example, in Brazilian favelas where this is not the case. Or so how come is it that we see these levels of violence? And I think that's I'm not necessarily sure that we need to think of these levels of this extremely extreme violence that we're seeing precisely to think of them as a concept per se, but understand it's a phenomenon that needs to be understood in terms of its variation. Because what we're seeing in the Mexican case, it's a high level of competition, as Guillermo showed in the beginning of the slides, that it's not only about the competition against amongst our organized criminal groups, but also against the state, and how that is maybe playing out. That those levels of competition are indeed playing out into how and when violence is being used. And as many others have, many other scholars, experts in organized crime have been pointing out, to look at the dynamics of protection. Angelica Duran Martinez specifically has been looking into when violence is more visible or less visible, for example. And so I think that over time, as we have seen how organized crime has evolved, we have looked into different dimensions and the ways in which violence can be displayed. One of the discussions that we have had when we think about criminal governance, for example, is that criminal governance indeed sometimes can be violent and sometimes does not necessarily have to be violent. And sometimes it displays the full menu of controls at the economic, political, social level, and sometimes it doesn't. So from my point of view right now, is not necessarily to think about in terms of the concept of violent repertoires, but more about how can we explain these levels of violence, which I think it's what we aim to do in the book, understanding the different strategies, because this is, as you can see, this is not only about using violence, it's about using a broad range of strategies that now have really probably sometimes overwhelmed us and have gone beyond what our initial understanding of organized crime and violence was about. Guillermo.
So it's questions about extreme violence, and again, you know, it seems to be that as every year passes by, Mexico seems to be rewriting the history of extreme violence, even within a very violent region as Latin America. So 180,000 battle deaths in state cartel conflicts. Nearly 80,000 people are missing, over 3,000 clandestine mass graves, and then we go on the tragic experiences of femicides and forced displacement, and the whole menu of different forms of violence that we typically see in civil wars. Typically, what you hear from the Mexican government, from many governments in Latin America, Juan, is we shift the attention to the social, to the communities, to the people, and start asking what's wrong with this deranged youth, and right away we get into that. But what we try to point out in the book is that if you think about the most lethal private army that emerged in Mexico's drug wars, the Zetas, they are defectors of elite military forces that were deployed to fight indigenous peoples in the South. Once they contain indigenous movements, they got bored and they got recruited by the Gulf Cartel. Some of the worst practices in terms of extreme violence that we've seen in Mexico were introduced by the Zetas. And this is actually crucial to understand because it goes beyond Mexico. If you look at the most extreme forms of violence in many countries in Central America and South America, they follow the playbook of practices that were that emerged during civil war in El Salvador, Guatemala, or even countries that did not experience civil war, but experienced anti-insurgency dirty wars like Brazil or Mexico. To the extent that those practices remain, it's those actors, those state specialists in violence that have taken extreme measures of atrocities. Those massacres that we see in Mexico today are the massacres that we saw in the 1970s during the Dirty War. These are the practices of the Secret Service, the police, and then they taught the state-level police, and then they taught different types of actors. To the extent that those actors remain in democracy, and they merge into the criminal underworld in different ways, they produce the type of atrocities that we see. So what I would say is, don't lose sight of these actors. One, it's not, very quickly we're going to blaming society, but it's these actors. If you dismantle, as Sandra said, criminal networks, criminal structures, start doing what many people in your own home country, Juan, Colombia, or people in Guatemala have been doing, is rather than deploy the military, a military with bad practices, do it through judicial processes. And I would just end with a very sort of tremendous lesson that we've learned in Mexico. The Zetas were dismantled in Guatemala through the work of the International Commission Against Impunity, the police, and the Attorney General's office at the time in the early 2010s, through a judicial process. The most lethal private army in Mexico that tried to conquer Guatemala was dismantled through police investigation, judicial prosecution, and the sentencing of high-risk courts. In Mexico, we follow the Iron Fist policy playbook of the 1970s, so the dirty wars of the type of practices that emerged in the Cold War, in the war against drug of Nixon. We imported a lot of that. Plan Colombia, Plan Mérida, militarize, boom, and then you create the type of extreme violence that we see these days. Thanks for the question, Juan.
Thank you both. We're pushing it a little bit, but if you don't mind just answering one last question, Pablo has been very patient here. Pablo, I don't know if you're able to ask it directly.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. First of all, thank you very much for that very interesting presentation. It's fascinating stuff. And I think the first part of my question was probably already answered, but and it's probably a bit unfair, but if we're linking everything to and it's a very good analysis. If we're linking everything to the type of transition to democracy, then, well, my obvious question is then what hope do we have now? If it seems like the obvious solution would be to go back to some form of autocracy and then transition again, which is not, beyond the realms of possibility. But more than that, my question is more linked to, it seems to me that you're talking a lot more about the decentralization process, perhaps, and the chaotic nature of the decentralization process that somehow overlap with the transition to democracy in Mexico. But I don't know, to my mind at least, they are parallel and very linked processes, but not necessarily the same, particularly considering because of the nature of the Mexican transition, as many others, there was very little alternative, I would imagine, other than this electoral route, which seemed to be the least violent form of achieving transition. And to an extent, I think if we go to other cases, maybe, outside the Latin American context, but perhaps in like Southern Europe or Central Eastern Europe, there's many other cases of countries that transition more or less electorally without really reforming institutions, that managed to avoid these sort of gray areas in the rule of law. So I don't know what you think about this link between decentralization and democratization, or if there should be a distinction between the two or not really.
I mean, I think for us, the key, Pablo, the key here is it's not that we would go back in time necessarily. So the question is, the initial question is it that because Mexico failed to reform the military, the police, the security sector, the judicial sector, it created these incentives for this intensification of violence, and now there's not much we can do. I think there's a lot that we can do, you know, go back in time, and many groups in Mexico, us included, have been arguing in favor of a transitional justice process. So it's a different transitional justice process that you would enact now than you would have done in 2000. So enter into the process of extraordinary mechanisms of justice. And why extraordinary mechanisms of justice? Well, because we've produced in Mexico levels of violence that ordinary institutions cannot handle. 180,000 battle deaths, over 80,000 people who've gone missing. I mean, the levels of violence, even if you reform the judicial system, and the judicial system in Mexico operated correctly, and the police and the military would stop repressing and colluding with organized criminal groups, it would take 50 years for ordinary institutions to take care of this. So you need to get into this very extensive growing dialogue in Mexico about extraordinary mechanisms of justice. And at the same time, you need to engage into changes in ordinary institutions. A former defense minister was arrested. Well, this is the time, maybe this is the opportunity to really look deep into changing Mexico's civilian military relationships, reform, democratize the armed forces, the police. Many of the reforms that we were expecting, many of us expected López Obrador to embrace, that he has not, and that he's reproduced many of the elements of his predecessors. This is the moment, this is the opportunity to rethink of why is it that we continue to have every year the most violent year in Mexico's contemporary history. Why is it, as Sandra said, Michoacán will probably have the most next year. Again, many of these states will have yet another cycle of elections and another major cycle of violence. How can you put a stop to this? I think there's many experiences. Many of us keep on looking into Guatemala. The International Commission Against Impunity, you need to reach out, not necessarily to US courts, to the United Nations. You need to put together a program that looks at many dimensions of the problem, the economic, the social, but specifically those that have been omitted and have to do with the security sector, the judiciary, and how that has enabled that politics and violence become intertwined.
Sandra, I don't know if you wanted to add something.
Yeah, just to say, I think, well, Guillermo has his new research agenda precisely focuses on the consequences of transitional justice mechanisms to a larger extent. And unfortunately, one of the things that the transition to democracy in Mexico really owes us is this transitional justice mechanisms, that although there were hopes that it could happen or that there could be reforms that could be taking place, it's not the case. And although it seems as I can side with this feeling of hopelessness to some extent, to think that, well, maybe there's no way around. I think that what we're seeing right now with what Raul was referring before, what has been happening with Garcia Luna, with Cienfuegos, it speaks to major reforms that should be taking place, that it can take place if there is a better understanding of how we got here. We hope that we can contribute to that in some way, but that to the extent that there's still misaligned incentives to all these processes of reform for the judicial and security forces. I think that's a problem. That the problem is not that we had party alternation, there's no other way around. We have competition, there's no other way around. Is the conditions under which this is happening, and there are ways to at least start turning the wheel around.
Maybe to summarize it in just in a word, rather than restore autocracy, deepen democracy.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much. I'm struggling to return me, but it's okay. We'll leave the focus where it is. For everyone that's interested, obviously, I encourage you to get a copy of the book. It's a really important text, and I think obviously if we're interested in Mexico and Latin America, it's useful, but I think this is going to be so much more broadly useful for many other contexts around the world. So thank you both so much for talking about your research today. Really, really important and relevant to what we're all working on too. There will also be a blog on the on UVRN Word on the Street blog, urbanviolence.org. So that will be from Sandra and Guillermo as well. Looking forward to that. So make sure you check that out. And apologies for this last plug for the Urban Violence Network. We're also just launching a video series where we're interviewing scholars. And since we have a lot of Latin American specialists here today, the first one which we're coming out today is with Lucia Dana on Chile. And you should be aware there's been an important vote in Chile yesterday, so I should be talking about that. But thank you both again for taking the time, really appreciate it, and for answering our questions. And best of luck with the research in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kieran, and to the audience and to King's College. Pleasure being here.
Thank you all.